Okay, so this week, to get you used to the new format, we're going to concentrate on news and answer more listeners' questions. Before we move on to the battlefield, let's start with the diplomatic developments. Last week, to coincide with the first anniversary of the war, the Chinese announced a plan to bring the war to an end. It contained 12 points to create conditions and platforms for negotiations to resume that included a demand for respect of national sovereignty and territorial integrity, and for the end of economic sanctions. It also called for all parties to strictly abide by international humanitarian law, avoid attacking civilians or civilian facilities, protect women, children, and other victims of the conflict. Now, President Zelensky and his aides have given the proposal a cautious welcome, saying they would welcome a dialogue with China. His charge d'affaires to China, Zhana Leshinska, called the paper a good sign and hoped that the Chinese would urge Russia to stop the war and withdraw its troops. But, she added, she did not at the moment see China as supporting Ukrainian efforts. So what's going on here, do you think, Patrick? Is this just more diplomatic maneuvering by China?
So 12 points as opposed to President Wilson's 14 points to bring the First World War to an end. We'll see how this one goes. I think if you're an optimist, you might see it as a positive sign that China, who for many decades, we should remember, played a pretty passive role, in fact, totally passive role in international diplomacy. And I suppose we could see this as a sign that they're increasingly keen to get engaged. The question is whether that engagement is positive or negative. I think we should pause before we get too excited. First, we've got to remember that although Beijing is presenting itself as a neutral party in all this, in reality, it's refused all along to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Instead, it's blamed the West for inflaming tensions as if there's some kind of near equivalence of guilt on both sides. You know, only last Friday it abstained for the fourth time, that is, from a UN vote demanding that Russia withdraw from Ukraine. Having said that, it didn't oppose the vote, unlike Syria, Iran, and North Korea, among others. And another of the points in its peace proposal was to state that nuclear crisis was to be avoided and that China opposes the research, development and use of chemical and biological weapons by any country under any circumstances. So all that sounds quite, making the right sort of noises in those departments. On the Ukrainian response, I doubt very much that they think this is a practical proposal that can be built on. But I think they were right to answer in the way that they did. There's nothing for them, I think, to be gained by alienating the Chinese. And by sounding cautiously enthusiastic, they make it difficult for Beijing to tilt further towards Moscow down the line in the months ahead. Wouldn't you say so? But it's a confused picture, and the Americans have been dumping huge amounts of cold water on it, haven't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think that with good reason they've been dumping huge amounts of cold water because the Chinese fairly typically, I would suggest, are playing a bit of a double game here. The Western leaders have been saying that Beijing does not have the international credibility to act as a mediator. And that's a fair point. The US National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, said the other day that his first reaction to it is that it could stop at point one, which is to respect the sovereignty of all nations. Forget about all the other points. Let's just look at that. And if we go along those lines, it's obvious what should happen next, which is a Russian withdrawal. Ukraine, he went on to say, wasn't attacking Russia. NATO wasn't attacking Russia. Russia's aims in the war were to wipe Ukraine off the map. Now, there's also the claim by the US government, which we mentioned last week, that Beijing is considering supplying weapons to Russia. This is a bit of a contradiction, frankly, to the idea that they're promoting peace. And this report became a little more concrete when Der Spiegel, the German magazine, ran a report that Moscow was in negotiations with a Chinese company about supplying large quantities of strike drones. China, for its part, has rejected the US claims as baseless smears and has not commented on the Der Spiegel report. But I think China has absolutely nothing to gain and plenty to lose, frankly, by tying itself to the diplomatic corpse that is Russia's war in Ukraine. Let's not kid ourselves. If the war had gone as planned and Moscow had taken Kiev and installed a pro-Russian regime in just a matter of days, China would have taken this as a signal that its own ambitions to invade Taiwan could now be realized. But that didn't happen, of course, and the US has been very clear in its intention to defend Taiwan. So what is China up to? Well, who knows? This may be misinformation or America sending out a signal that any of the arming of Russia simply won't be tolerated.
But the signals are generally very, very difficult to read, aren't they? I mean, on the one hand, they're making this peace proposal, the Chinese, that is. And then on the other hand, they're talking about having a new friendship deal with Belarus. They've announced on Monday what they call an all-weather and comprehensive strategic partnership with Belarus, at the same time as they're trying to introduce some sort of concrete diplomatic peace proposals. I mean, Belarus is essentially Russia to all intents and purposes when it comes to diplomacy. So this sounds remarkably cloth-eared, I think. And it turns out President Lukashenko is going to be visiting, I think, later on this week, for talks with senior officials, though not actually with the boss himself, with Xi Jinping. Anyway, let's move on to Bakhmut, the town north of Donetsk, which has been the focus of the heaviest fighting in recent months, where Ukrainian forces have been essentially under siege from the north and the east. They've been repelling continuous attacks, often led by the mercenaries of the Wagner Group. Well, the signs are this morning that the battle may be reaching a critical point, with the Russians raising the tempo to new levels. I saw some film the other day. I don't know if you've seen this, Saul. It's taken from a drone, and it's really quite extraordinary. Very, very dramatic picture of what's happened to the city. It's basically been completely bombed to rubble by these months and months of artillery bombardments. And there's some footage also from the ground of some Ukrainian troops inside what looked like a factory, and it very much put me in mind of Stalingrad. It looked very similar to the famous black and white film taken inside the Volgograd tractor plant. So rather kind of chilling reminder once again of how we're seeing the past resurrected in this war. Now, people are talking about this battle. The kind of conventional wisdom is that strategically it doesn't have huge significance for the Russians, that even though I think capturing it would open the way to the Russian takeover of the rest of the Donetsk Oblast. And that would put Putin in a place where he could claim that a key war aim had been achieved. But I think it's true that it's really the kind of psychological value of the thing that is causing the Russians to expend so much effort on it. I mean, Putin desperately needs a success. But it seems to me that the Ukrainians have made a bit of a mistake by investing a lot of military prestige in holding on to it. Only the other day, on Tuesday, President Zelensky said defense of the city was essential. What do you think, Saul?
Well, we're getting mixed messages from the Ukrainians, actually. You're absolutely right. On the one hand, there's been this line in Ukraine for a long time, Bakhmut holds. I mean, it's like Verdun in the First World War and Stalingrad in the Second, as you say, Patrick. But also Zelensky's been preparing the ground for a possible withdrawal too, saying we might not be staying there forever, which might indicate, you might assume it indicates that a withdrawal is going to happen relatively soon. The consequences of losing Bakhmut, of course, are absolutely crucial. As you say, the Russians need a win. They think it could lead to the taking over the rest of Donetsk. I don't think that's likely, to be truthful, Patrick. Its strategic significance is relatively important in the sense that it's sited just on the edge of high ground, and that could be a jumping off point. But that would imply that the Russian army and the Russian forces are in a state, given the casualties they've taken over just a few miles of ground in Bakhmut, to really launch another advance. I simply don't think it's that likely. So yes, it was possibly a mistake to say we're going to hold on to it, per se, but they haven't lost it yet, Patrick, and that's another important point to make. It does look like it's going to fall, but it hasn't fallen yet, and it hasn't fallen for a long time, and it's looked very, very shaky during that period. Now, interestingly, if we talk about Russian capability, a report from the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War in Washington, D.C., notes that Russia continues to use up its already limited stock of precision weapons, and that a captured Russian military manual suggests that Moscow's forces are implementing new assault tactics to overcome their lack of offensive capability. This is really interesting. So what are these capabilities? The use of smaller and more agile combined armed formations that were used earlier in the war. And it reminds me, as I'm sure it reminds you, Patrick, of the stormtroopers used by German troops at the end of World War I. and even Russian infiltration tactics during the Battle of Stalingrad. The extent to which all of this is actually going to make a difference is another matter. It's a tweaking, and I think it's partly been promoted actually by some of the tactics Wagner are using, but nevertheless, they're losing an astonishing number of soldiers.
Well, it all sounds very good, doesn't it? But I don't know how they're going to retrain their troops into this, quite sophisticated new approach in the time available, or indeed, where that would actually happen. And what seems to be happening is what's been going on all along. They're using up soldiers' lives at an astonishing rate. And this use of Russian soldiers as cannon fodder is something that's got a very long tradition. We're going to hear from Simon Sebag Montefiore next week. Whether it'll achieve, if it actually exists, whether it'll achieve a breakthrough against an agile Ukrainian army with all its sophisticated Western weapons, I don't think so. And we've got another reminder, haven't we, that some very timeless factors, as old as warfare itself, are at play in the conflict at the moment. I'm talking about the weather, of course. Temperatures are rising, and with a thaw and the rainfall, fields and roads are turning into swamps and rivers, and all the technology in the world can't really overcome that. There's a word for it, apparently, in Russian, rasputitsa, which means literally no road. And the Ukrainians have a very similar concept in their word bezdorozhya, which means roadlessness. So there you are, Saul. Anyway, on the subject of Western weapons, there's an interesting bit of news this week about Ukrainian tankers learning to operate the Challenger 2 tanks down at Bovington in Dorset. And apparently they were taking to it like ducks to water, with one describing the Challenger as more technically advanced and user-friendly than they were used to. And they hope to complete their training in about a month. So what do you think that tells us about the timing of the great Ukrainian counteroffensive?
Well, it's an interesting indication, isn't it? It won't be until at least late March, early April, possibly a little bit later than that. But we've also had a fascinating clue as to its possible location, which was given by Vadim Skibitsky, the deputy head of Ukrainian military intelligence, who told the German newspaper Berliner Morgenpost, "It is one of our strategic goals that we try to drive a wedge in the Russian front in the south between occupied Crimea and Russia." He added, "It is possible that we will also destroy arms depots or military equipment on Russian territory, for example, around the city of Belgorod." Now, the spring offensive is aimed, he went on to say, at liberating the entire country. So that's just emphasizing the point. They want to get back all their territory, including Crimea. But let's get down to the nitty-gritty here. The effect of the counteroffensive, if Skibitsky is right, would be to sever the land bridge between Crimea and Russia, leaving Russian forces in the south of Ukraine reliant for supplies on the damaged Kerch Bridge. This, of course, if it happens, would pose a serious threat to Russia's hold on Crimea. But given that Ukraine has indicated an attack in one direction before and attack somewhere else, might this be another case of misdirection, do you think, Patrick?
Yeah, they do seem to be very free and easy, don't they, with the predictions and projections of what they're going to do. And it does make you think, well, would they really be doing that? Would they really be being so frank if that was their genuine intention? I was also struck by what Skibitsky said about attacks on Russian territory. That was a red line before, wasn't it? But, it sounds like they've got the means to actually do this. Only this week, Ukrainian forces were able to blow up an arms dump in Mariupol, which is, Russian occupied in southeastern Ukraine. And up until recently, had been out of range. So this might be the use of these new long-range bombs that you're very keen on, Saul, aren't you? That the Americans have been sending. Anyway, the Ukrainians, I think, won't make any secret of the fact that they can now bombard at greater distances than they were doing before. What do you reckon to this weird bit of news out of Belarus about the attack on the Russian spy plane, the Beriev A-50, which is a kind of AWACS aircraft? Now, this was said to have been destroyed by drones operated by members of the Belarusian resistance. Well, we know a lot of people don't like the regime, but we haven't really heard much about any armed resistance before, have we, Saul?
No, not much, although there have been sort of, various mentions in the press that there have been attacks on infrastructure. We'll come on to that in a second. I mean, the source of the information you're referring to is Bipol. This is an opposition movement, and it insists the attack took place at the Malkolisky air base, and that's near Minsk in the capital of Belarus. The damage is serious, said Bipol. And Bipol's members, interesting enough, include former security officials who resigned in protest at the brutal crushing of anti-regime demonstrations at Russia's behest in 2020. Bipol went on to detail the fact that the front and central part of the spy aircraft, including its radar, were damaged as a result of two explosions.
Well, that claim actually was backed up, I read, by an advisor to Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who's the exiled Belarusian opposition leader, who said the attack was the most serious against Russian forces in Belarus since the start of the war. Now, this is quite a serious bit of kit. They cost about £274 million each, and the Russians have only got 9 of them. And it has been operating out of Belarus. Apparently, it's been on 6 missions, overflying Ukraine and doing target direction. But the story has actually been confirmed by some of these ultra-nationalist, pro-war Russian mill bloggers and journalists. So it sounds like it's a real thing.
Welcome back. We've been getting an increasing number of listeners' questions, which is one of the reasons why we've decided to move to 2 podcasts a week, to give us a chance to do the questions justice. Now, the first one this week is from Mark from Liverpool. He writes, "Morning. Would the development of a Wagner-style group within NATO countries be a good workaround for getting boots on the ground in Ukraine without causing World War III? Ukraine could pay for it with the funding it is getting from allies." He goes on to say, "The podcasts are great. Keep up the good work, etc." Thanks so much, Mark. It's an interesting one, Patrick, isn't it? I mean, there are various legions. We know there's a Russian legion, actually, which was mentioned in a report by our good friend Anthony Lloyd in the Times recently. So something similar is already happening, but Wagner style in terms of mercenaries, I'm not sure that's a particularly good look, Patrick. What do you think?
No, I don't think that was going to fly. And indeed, it's not actually working for the Russians either, is it? Okay, they've been using them in this cannon fodder role with, limited success. But what does it tell you about the Russian state, that they have to rely on paid soldiers to do their work for them? It has the potential to be a force within the state that could potentially turn hostile, which is what we're seeing at the moment. And all the signs are that they're trying to rein Wagner in. Prigozhin is becoming increasingly sort of a loose cannon. And so it's not, it just seems to me to be an indication of weakness if you actually have to pay people to fight and allow a warlord, essentially like Prigozhin, to get some traction inside your country. What does that say about your sovereignty? So I think it's, I don't think anyone would be seriously looking at it. And as you say, Saul, these people who are fighting who aren't non-Ukrainian combatants are essentially in the role of the international brigades in Spain and the Spanish Civil War. They're there for good motivations, which don't have very much to do with money.
Yeah, and on the subject of Prigozhin, I mean, I noticed a report this week that suggests, it was an opinion rather than factual, of course, but suggests that he's a dead man walking. I mean, he's made it so many enemies with his criticism, very robust criticism of senior figures in the Russian military, including, of course, Shoigu, the defense minister, that, he is sooner or later going to be taken out. Well, we'll see where that one goes. Now, here's an interesting one from Jeffrey Russell from South Carolina. It's quite long, so I'm just going to read the sort of relevant bits. And he says, I listen to your weekly podcasts as soon as they are released. Coverage here in the US is usually limited to 60 to 90 seconds on the network news. So your in-depth coverage is much needed and appreciated. You are doing, he says, a service to the people of Ukraine. Well, thank you, Jeffrey. We appreciate that. Now, here's to his question. What other sources can you recommend for more in-depth information on the war? There are some out there, but I'm dubious of their accuracy. Your informed direction would be greatly appreciated. Well, we don't want to give away all our secrets as to where we're getting our information, and we're getting it from all over the place. But the ones that I've used, I rely on in particular for getting details every week, Patrick, are, listeners won't be surprised to hear, the Institute for the Study of War. I'm on their mailing list, so just go to their website and you can sign up there. The Kiev Independent Online newspaper, which is in English, is one of the best sources from inside Ukraine. And of course, we've mentioned him before, Phillips O'Brien, professor at St. Andrews University, but he has a Substack newsletter. If you follow him on Twitter, just, type in Phillips O'Brien, you'll find him quite quickly. And he has a weekly newsletter that'll set you straight too.
Yeah, they're both excellent sources. In terms of mainstream media, you mentioned earlier Anthony Lloyd. He's a friend of the podcast, a friend of mine from way back. His reporting from Ukraine for the Times, he's a real seasoned veteran now, has been at it for decades. I find it superb. Also, on the kind of analytical front, I would urge you to read Mark Galeotti's contributions, which you can read in The Spectator. They're extremely good, very insightful. He's clearly got a lot of contacts still inside Russia, so you get some quite sort of juicy updates on things and insights that I don't see elsewhere. So definitely have a look at that. Okay, Ivaras Gulbinas is back in touch. He's been a very enthusiastic contributor of questions. He lives in Lithuania. And Ivaras asks, Ukraine uses more shells than the Allies make now. Can production ramp up to satisfy the hunger of the Ukrainian army quickly enough and in time? Is this realistic, having in mind all the complexities to make production of these weapons on a more massive scale in Western economies? Now, he seems to be talking about both shells and weaponry here. What do you reckon, Saul?
Well, yeah, the answer is yes, they can. But this is it's a good question for my virus because it's concerning quite a lot of people, actually. So senior military people or ex-military people in America are making the same point. And we do have to begin to ramp up production, not only because the Ukrainians need the kit now, need the weapons now, need the ammunition now, but also because we are working through our stocks as well. So yes, it's possible. Yes, it's important, and it needs to happen soon, and it needs a bit of political direction, frankly.
One here from Graham. I've recently started listening to the podcast and enjoying the information given. I'm wondering, is there support from elsewhere in the world, like Africa and Asia, being given to Ukraine? Well, I think this raises the whole question of the degree of global support that Ukraine is getting and how nations have divided up. I think what's been lost, actually, is the recognition that the whole world doesn't see the conflict in the way that we do here in Europe and the West. For example, no country in Africa, South America, or the Middle East has imposed sanctions on Russia, nor, of course, has China. So I saw a statistic the other day that only 18% of the world's population live in countries where sanctions have been imposed. If you look at the kind of the sanctions map, if you like, there's basically a north-south divide. So, I mean, just the map of where Russian aircraft are allowed to fly in and out of without any restrictions. That's the whole kind of the southern hemisphere, basically: Africa, South America, China, India, the Arabian Peninsula. That seems to me to be a bit of a reflection of the old Cold War sort of heritage. Do you think that's right, Saul?
Yeah, absolutely is right. And, there's still this kind of sense that the West and America and Britain in particular are the old imperialists. The Cold War analogy is a good one because a lot of countries haven't been able to shake their kind of sense of the West as being their old, kind of imperial masters, and therefore, to a certain extent, their enemies. So, yes, that is still playing out today. And it's fascinating, isn't it, to think that only 18% of the world is actually supporting sanctions. On the other hand, Patrick, we should stress the vote that was in the UN last week at the anniversary of the start of the war, which there was an almost unanimous over 140 countries voting for, an immediate end to the war and Russia leaving Ukraine's territory. So, 6 voted against, the usual suspects. We've already mentioned them on the pod. But 144 tells you that there is broad support for Ukraine, much broader than is actually putting its arm up and saying we're prepared to take a bit of economic pain. Okay, let's move on to another one from Arnie. He writes, "Hi guys, really enjoying the podcast. Great place for cutting through the spin and getting some real information from real journalists. I fully understand that sending complex and very expensive jets like the Typhoon or F-16 is a bit of a hard ask, but how about the the Hawk jet, which is cheaper. Now, this, I should say, this question from Arnie, we could also take in conjunction with another question, which says, why are we not sending helicopters if planes are too expensive to send? Well, I think Arnie's right. We could start sending these slightly less sophisticated jets, which are actually probably better at ground attack than some of the more sophisticated ones. But also on the subject of helicopters, some helicopters have been sent. There are some Apaches in the Ukrainian arsenal. And recently, interestingly enough, the British sent 3 Sea Kings. Now, it's not many, I know, but it's better than nothing. So I think we are going down that track. And sooner or later, as we keep saying, they are going to get the things they need.
Yeah, on the Hawk jet, I mean, it may be a cheaper, less complicated and all the rest of it, but it's still going to be just as vulnerable to what we've spoken about before, which is the pretty sophisticated and effective, in-depth ground-to-air Russian defenses. So I think, the caveats that the West had before remain the same, whatever the actual airplane is, that they just don't want to see loads of their stuff being shot down by the Russians. On the helicopter front, the old Sea King, I mean, that's been around for donkey's years, hasn't it? So it must be 50 years old at least. I mean, probably nearer 60 years old. I can't imagine that's got any military, sort of aggressive capability. It must be really being used in a support role, but a fantastic bit of kit. Okay, we've got one here from Simon, who says it's reported that Russia's lost 50% of its armour, having spent some 25 years in the army. I would suggest that their capability is far less. The armour they have pushed forward will be the roadworthy specimens, and I would surmise that the material left behind is extremely poor. They must be reaching their nadir. Well, great once again to have someone who really knows what they're talking about asking a question. I think you're absolutely right. In any kind of assessment of what your resources are, there's always a number, which is the big number, and then there's the real number, which is how many of those are actually serviceable. And it can be anything from, the actual usable kit can be just as little as half of what you've actually got on the books. So, yeah, I think that's probably the reality. And, of course, the quality of the kit's going to be nothing like as good as what they'll be up against in the coming months with these new main battle tanks coming in from the West. Is that how you read it, Saul?
Yeah, exactly. I think so. I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? They initially started out with, and as you say, Patrick, this big number, 2,600 pieces of armor. And that, of course, covers a multitude of sins. But anyway, let's go with that number. They reckon they've lost about half of that, or at least reports say they've lost about half of that. So if they've got 1,300 left, Simon's point is actually all that 1,300 are not going to be serviceable. They must be nearing their nadir, as he says. And that's very much the sense I'm getting too, which is why, going back to these small unit attacks, they're attacking with infantry and they're taking appalling casualties.